The 1980s 1990s introduction. By the late 1970s, America began experiencing dramatic domestic changes. Through mass organizing, civil rights, liberation, and feminist movements effectively pressured the U.S. government to institute anti discrimination and affirmative action policies that opened educational and employment opportunities that were once closed to women and people of color. Attitudes about race in particular began to change, increasing diversity was taken seriously, political correctness was encouraged, and open bigotry was frowned upon. However, those in power determined the limits of change by weakening the civil rights and liberation movements through reform and repression. The US government effectively co opted the more moderate sectors of the movements with reforms and offers of political positions while destroying the most radical elements through COINTEL or counterintelligence operations, which included imprisonment, forced exile, and assassination of key leaders. The end result, which became evident by the 1980s, was a trickle up effect. Limited numbers of women and people of color accessing resources for socioeconomic mobility, but the historical exploitative and oppressive systems and institutions remained intact. Thus, while it is important to recognize the various gains won by the civil rights and liberation movements, these victories fell short from their objectives of genuine equality and freedom, and many historical patterns resurfaced once again during the 1980s and 1990s. Conservative political agendas resurfaced with the Reagan administration. Reaganomics pushed for the cutting of taxes that dramatically impacted social services and education. Local, state, and federal agencies cut funding for job training, healthcare, and after school programs. For example, by the late 1980s, the California public school system was ranked at the lowest, spending roughly 2,000 less per pupil than the state average. Across the country, retention and success programs lost funding and high school dropout rates began to soar. Those from the middle class, both whites and people of color, either pulled their children from public schools and enrolled them in private schools or moved entirely from decaying cities to the suburbs. The Reagan administration also attacked unions, leaving workers vulnerable to the neoliberal agenda that put profit over the well being of people. By the 1980s, steady employment for the working class began to disappear. Good paying blue collar factory jobs, such as Goodyear, Firestone, General Motors, Bethlehem Steel, and American Bridge, closed down and moved overseas, taking advantage of lower wages in other countries. Thousands of jobs were lost, impacting the social and economic stability of entire communities and sometimes entire cities. This resulted in massive unemployment and poverty across the country. In 1990, Los Angeles had a 30% unemployment rate, while Detroit experienced an unprecedented exodus of its population. The frequent economic recessions, outsourcing of jobs, and cuts in government spending and social services created widespread discontent. While the cost of living steadily increased, wages and salaries remained stagnant. Resentment festered amongst working and middle class whites, and xenophobic and nativist rhetoric resurfaced. As in the past, many politicians once again built their political platforms by scapegoating immigrants and people of color. New policies attacked the various gains won during the 1960s and 1970s, including the dismantling of affirmative action policies, bilingual education, and government assistance for the poor. Public discourse shifted from actively dismantling all forms of inequality and discrimination to a self proclaimed argument that we've reached equality. America is colorblind, and there is no longer a need for race and gender based politics. The media further vilified immigrants and people of color as criminals and blamed them for overcrowding schools, draining social services, and taking jobs they didn't deserve. In actuality, Reaganomics did not necessarily reduce government spending, it merely shifted the focus from the public to the private sector. With increased cuts on social services and public education, including grants for college and universities, the government increased spending on the growing prison industrial complex. Private prisons for profit required increasing numbers of prisoners, and the war on drugs and related policies did just that. It transformed every aspect of the justice system to increase the prison population to alarming levels, without significantly reducing crime. In the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander argued that while the use and selling of drugs crosses racial boundaries equally, the war targeted poor and working class areas and specifically communities of color throughout the country. Police departments from New York and Chicago to Los Angeles and Oakland gained notorious reputations for racial profiling and repressive policing in black and brown communities, and subsequently prison populations continued soaring with disproportionate numbers of blacks and Latinos. Along with the growing prison industry, the U.S. continued to increase its military spending. Beginning in the 1950s and continuing through the 1980s, the U.S. spent trillions of American tax dollars combating the communist threat. Congress committed a tremendous amount of resources to the nuclear arms buildup, including a defunct Star Wars defense system supposedly to offset Soviet nuclear capabilities. The U.S. carried out several covert and proxy wars, providing economic and military aid, most of which supported a long list of dictators and military regimes across the globe in attempts to prevent nationalist, communist, and other left leaning movements. Particular focus was Southeast Asia and Central America, both areas containing strong worker, peasant, and indigenous leftist movements. The U.S. government committed CIA and other covert operatives and provided military aid and training to repressive governments and military regimes in the Philippines, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. Most notably, the Reagan administration funded and trained the Contras, a counter revolutionary organization attempting to overthrow the Nicaraguan socialist government. When Congress halted funding for the program, the Reagan administration illegally sold arms to Iran and funneled that money to the Contras, extending civil war in the region. Instability and civil strife resulted in massive Central American immigration by the tens of thousands, many of whom headed for the United States. While widespread organized rebellion may have been subdued, radical tendencies challenging the conservative agenda continued throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The anti nuclear war movement reigned prominent, which crossed national, racial, gender, and class and cultural boundaries. As the US and Soviet Union advanced military technology and stockpiled thousands of nuclear warheads, tens of thousands across the globe marched and protested, fearing that humanity could be wiped out with a push of the button. Growing numbers of Americans no longer believed that the Soviet Union was a real threat to American democracy and way of life. As atrocities in Central America surfaced and credible sources publicly linked American tax dollars to oppressive regimes and death squads committing genocide, the American public began to speak out and organize. The Latino community and many white allies, both leftist and religious groups spearheaded various forms of protest and resistance against U.S. militarism. Thousands protested the School of the Americas, military training school where many of the oppressive military officers graduated from. Others from various religious faiths also participated in the sanctuary movement, where Central Americans escaping violence found sanctuary in churches and private homes. Many Central Americans feared reprisals if the U.S. deported them back to their home countries and sought political asylum. The sanctuary movement supported refugees with everything from homes, temporary employment, English courses, to additional support and legal aid for those forced to go underground. With the changing demographics in American cities, the working class and poor continue to do what they have done for generations: build community. In the midst of conservative cutbacks, individuals and organizations continue to provide much needed services for community survival and stability. Numerous community centers and nonprofit organizations provided employment, housing, mental health, and substance abuse services, along with academic and recreational support for urban youth. These agencies provided critical services for individuals and families and prevented many communities from breaking at the seams. They lacked, however, any social or political education or awareness and therefore failed to recognize any effective systematic change. New cultural forms of resistance took root in urban America. Theater, art, public muralism, and dance continued to give voice to the marginalized and excluded. In particular, hip hop culture emerged from the ghettos of America. Like the blues, jazz, and rock and roll of generations before, black cultural expression once again took America by storm. Rejected and marginalized at first, earned its place in the cultural arts world and became a worldwide phenomenon. America's upper and middle class indifference to the plight of the working class and poor and the government's neglect and inability to effectively address the conditions in urban America resulted in the resurfacing of racial and class tensions, a pressure cooker that occasionally exploded. For example, the 1992 Los Angeles riots, rebellions. By the early 1990s, Los Angeles had the second largest homeless population. In a 3 mile radius of South Central, there were 640 liquor stores, but not one community center or movie house. And 600 youth were killed from gang or drug related incidents in 1991 alone. When a majority white jury acquitted police officers for the beating of Rodney King caught on film, thousands of frustrated poor and working class Californians took to the streets. Regardless of the sensationalized and racist media coverage, the events forced America to acknowledge and take action on the declining social and economic conditions in urban areas across the country. The marginalization and exclusion of poor and working class Americans, the majority people of color, cannot go on as normal, unnoticed, or business as usual. Following the 1965 Watts riots, less than 30 years before, civil rights leader Martin Luther King expressed, "A riot is the voice of the unheard." The above is an introduction. Further details and analysis are in the assigned readings and materials.